Hi students, this is your Literary Devices video number 1, which will go over the first 5 devices that you need to know for this unit. So let's start with analogy. So analogy is a comparison between two concepts. This might seem similar to a simile, which is a comparison between two unlike things using like or as, or similar to a metaphor, which is comparing two unlike things. However, the key word here is concept. You are comparing two concepts. Therefore, analogies are going to be more complex than similes or metaphors. And the purpose of analogy is to draw parallels between a familiar idea and an unfamiliar idea. So here, let's look at this more specific definition. An analogy is a comparison between two things, and the comparison is used to determine the relationship between different sets of things. So here we have bark is to dog as meow is to cat. So bark and meow are the sounds that a dog and cat makes. So you wouldn't just say something like the dog was a bear to show that the dog was as big and scary as a bear. That is a metaphor. Here with an analogy, you're not just directly comparing two things, but two concepts. So you're comparing the relationship of bark and dog to the relationship between meow and cat. That's why analogies are more complex. So let's look at it in a literary example. So here it says, the sword is to a warrior as the pen is to a writer. So say somebody understands how war works, and they understand that a warrior needs a sword to fight his or her battles. Here we have pen is to a writer. So what this is saying, or explaining to someone who might not understand how a writer works, the writer uses the pen to fight his or her battles. So the sword and the pen are the same, serve the same purpose as they do to the warrior and the writer. So it helps clarify why the pen is important to the writer by creating comparison to the sword and the warrior. Let's look at one more example. This one's a little more complex. So it says, with all due respect, Your Highness, how can we entertain the idea of a dog who developed his ideas while on the street? So here, the comparison is happening between an individual and a dog who developed his ideas while on the streets. So while we don't see a direct comparison happening in the text, it is actually happening. It's inferred. While this creature doesn't state who he's comparing the dog on the street to, it's inferred that he's making the comparison. Now, this is not a simile because of the following. Here, a politician of some sort or some kind of influential person is being compared to a dog on the street. Now, dogs on the streets are considered untrustworthy. They might bite you or steal a hamburger out of your hand. This is being compared to how a politician might steal money out of your wallet. Therefore, a comparison is being made to how a politician operates to how a dog on the street operates. And therefore, that comparison is more complex, making it an analogy. Now let's move on to our next word, our literary device, which is an allusion. So an allusion is a reference to a famous person, place, thing, work of art, literature, music, something in pop culture. And its purpose is to let readers understand new information by connecting it to something they already know. So for example, Family Guy uses a ton of allusions. So here Stewie, with his blocks, has created the word red rum. This is an allusion to The Shining, where Danny writes red rum on the door. And we realize that the mirror reflection of red rum is murder. So by comparing Stewie to The Shining, the purpose of it is to show that Stewie, if you've watched the show, you know this, is kind of, evil. He's pretty much consistently trying to murder his mother. So that is how the allusion works. Let's look at it in literature. So here T.S. Eliot in The Burial of the Dead writes, "Summer surprised us coming over the Starnbergersee with a shower of rain. We stopped in the colonnade and went on in sunlight into the Hofgarten and drank coffee and talked for an hour." So here Eliot makes references to the Starnbergersee and Hofgarten, which are important royal places in Germany. Instead of these actual places, however, they're meant to show the beauty of life. So the purpose of the allusion referencing these German places is to emphasize how beautiful life is. So remember that allusions aren't just a reference of famous place, person, or thing. It's to make a larger statement. Now let's move on to alliteration, which hopefully you guys are familiar with, because we see it all the time. So an alliteration is the repetition of the initial sounds in neighboring words, such as Allie ate apples all afternoon. If you've read The Raven, you also know that Edgar Allan Poe used a lot of alliteration, such as in the line, "While I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping," where nodded, nearly, and napping all start with the same sounds, making it an alliteration. Now, a common myth is that alliterations need to happen next to each other, that the words that start with the same sound must be right next to each other in the sentence. That is not true. Alliterations just need to occur closely to each other, so within sentences that are near each other. So look at these examples. The deep churned, something had happened down in the dim, foggy green depths. So deep, down, dim, and depths all start with the D sound. But notice that they're not right next to each other, but rather in sentences that are next to each other. Then look at this next example. Touch each object you want to touch as if tomorrow your tactile sense would fail. So again, these words that start with the T sound are not right next to each other, they're just close to each other. Now, what is the purpose of an alliteration? The purpose of an alliteration is to emphasize the words or ideas. When you're reading and you come upon an alliteration, it catches your attention because of that repetitive sound. And oftentimes this emphasis is to show a contrast of ideals or to have a melodic effect because it rolls off the tongue. But ultimately, it's to draw the reader's attention to something important. Now let's move on to diction. So diction has many different definitions, but the definition that we're going to look at is connotation, where it's implicit rather than explicit meaning of a word and consists of the suggestions, associations, and emotional overtones attached to a word. All right, so what does that definition actually mean? So diction gives power to a writing. It creates its tone. So for instance, in these examples, I told him that I didn't have a clue what he was up to. I was about to bounce when he got up in my grill and started talking smack. Okay, well, that's an informal tone created by informal diction, such as grill and smack and bounce. However, if we reword this exact sentence into, I told him that I wasn't quite sure what he was doing. I was about to leave when he came up to me. He got very close to me in an attempt to intimidate me, then began speaking rudely to me. This is a formal way to say exactly what the past informal sentence said. So we have informal tone created by informal diction, and then formal tone created by formal diction. So the word choice that you use directly creates a tone. So let's look at this next example here. The bitter, rotten fruit swelled sickeningly in the heat, oozing a gruesome pulpy pus as the afternoon sun baked into further fever. So, well, here we see some alliteration, but that's not what we're exactly looking at here. The words bitter, rotten, swelled, sickeningly, gruesome, pulpy, pus, and fever are all words that have to do with kind of being gross and ill and disgusting, and therefore it creates that tone. So the diction, again, creates the tone. Now, one last way to explain it. If we look at these three words, creature, monster, and critter, they all ultimately have the same definition of being a non-human entity. However, which one of these words would be most scary? Most of us would say monster is the most scary of these three words. When we picture a monster in our head, we picture something like this that might eat us in a really scary, horrifying way. Now, what comes next? Which is the next of the most scary of these words? Probably creature. Now, if you look at this picture of a creature, that's pretty scary. You definitely wouldn't want to meet that in a forest, but it's not as directly scary as this monster. It's just a really big animal that doesn't exist in the real world. Then if we think of critter, we kind of picture this. It's still kind of monsterish. It has the same teeth, but ultimately it's cute, and if we found it under our bed, we might end up hugging it as opposed to actually being scared of it. So diction has to do with the connotative meaning of the word. It's what we picture in our heads when we read those words, and if we use those words together, it creates tone. All right, let's go to our last word of the video, hyperbole. So hyperbole is an exaggerated statement or claim not meant to be taken literally. So for instance, we've heard this phrase before, I'm so hungry I could eat a horse. This guy is not going to eat a horse. One, that's really cruel, and two, it's impossible. Horses are bigger than he is. His stomach could not actually consume that much food without exploding. So this is hyperbolic. It is not possible. So again, we see another example where this girl says, clean all the things. Though she's very excited and it seems like she wants to clean all the things, it's not possible for her to do so. For instance, she can't take that broom to the moon and sweep up all that moon dust. Therefore, it's hyperbolic. Now, hyperboles are an obvious and purposeful statement of exaggeration. And why do we use them? It's for emphasis and dramatic effect to make a clear point. So, this is kind of a creepy example, but let's read it. Here's the smell of blood still. All the perfumes of Arabia will not sweeten this little hand. So, what it's saying is that somebody's committed a terrible crime, and nothing, absolutely nothing, is going to make that crime go away. Now, what's hyperbolic is that you can't get all of the perfume in Arabia. That's a lot of perfume. It's not possible to do that. And so the hyperbole is emphasizing the severity of the crime. Now, for our very last example, let's look at an example from the American folklore Paul Bunyan. So here it reads, well now, one winter it was so cold that all the geese flew backwards and all the fish moved south and even the snow turned blue. Late at night it got so frigid that all spoken words froze solid afore they could be heard. People had to wait until sunup to find out what folks were talking about the night before. So none of these things could actually happen. They're all hyperbolic. But the purpose of the hyperbole is to emphasize just how cold it was that night. So those are the 5 words that you need to know. Make sure that you take notes on all 5 of these words. Remember that you need to put down the definition of these words, how they work, and the purpose of them. So you should have 3 things for all 5 literary devices in your notes. Then make sure to share those notes with me, Miss Geis. That way I can give you full credit for your homework. All right, have a great night.